Welcome to all of our listeners out there. I'm your host, James Gilbert. Thank you for joining another episode of Banking on Experience. Really excited about today's topic because it's something we haven't talked about. I think I say that on every episode, but it's actually true, which is really good. But you know what? Before I get started, I want to also make sure that all of our listeners know to come subscribe to the podcast. Make sure that we have more people see it and more people get to know it a little bit more. Today, we are going to be talking about why financial planning should be about integrating into everyday life. So we're going to be talking about a little bit of a difference there. We're going to be joined from the founder of Facet Wealth, so co-founder of Facet Wealth. So give us just a second and we'll get started. All right, everybody, thank you for joining us today. We are joined by Anders. Anders, you are the co-founder and CEO of Facet Wealth.
Yes.
Want to welcome you to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, James. Appreciate it.
I'm excited about this topic. Let's before we get started though, I'd love to know, let the audience get to know you a little bit personally.
Yeah.
What'd you have for breakfast and where's your favorite place to vacation?
Good questions. I'm actually not a big breakfast guy. I usually have like 2 cups of coffee and then around 11 o'clock have like a granola bar, and that's about it. So and that it's not for any reason other than that's just sort of like the way that my eating has evolved in the morning over time. Like I'm not on like a crazy diet or anything like that, but it's just how it works. But I will say that first cup of coffee really hits different every morning. Favorite place to vacation, man, that's really that depends too. I got to say, I think probably top of the list is Montana. I have some family friends with a place out there, and I've been going out there for close to 20 years, if not more. And it's just really, really gorgeous out there. So looking forward to getting back in the summertime.
Do you go up to Glacier Lake? Is that where you go when you go?
I've been up there. These guys are just outside of Missoula, so not that far away, a couple hours, but it's such a beautiful state. You know, it's hard to go wrong anywhere there.
People don't realize that about Montana. It's a little hidden gem, if you ask me. Like people think it's a lot like Wyoming and just barren, and it's not.
Yeah. It's no, it's a great it's a great state. Actually, we should probably delete this part of the podcast. I don't want to give the secret away.
Hey, you know what? We definitely could do that. We'll cut this out for sure.
There we go.
So, Anders, let's give the audience kind of a rundown of why did we come to this topic? What makes you so passionate about financial planning and ensuring that it gets integrated into everyday life and that it's not just one of those things where it's a finance thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I can give you a little bit of background on Facet and what we do to set the context, and then I can tell you a little bit about sort of our founding story, which will probably leave a number of people shaking their heads at the state of the world that we came into when we started the company. But you know, Facet is a company that is really focused on building financial planning the way that it should be. And our view on that is that financial planning goes way beyond just managing money, which is what most people think of when they think of working with a financial advisor. And it really touches every aspect of money in your life. So things like cash flow, things like saving for your kids' college, things like thinking about your student debt and are you paying the right amount, or is there a better rate available to you? Everything that involves money that touches your life. We feel that you should have an expert guiding you or helping you through those decisions, whether they're big and small. And so that's what Facet does. We work with folks that have enough nuance and complexity in their financial life that a purely DIY digital solution isn't going to cut it, but also don't have the wealth or asset levels to work with a traditional advisor that a traditional advisor would really be interested in working with. So it's a huge number of people. It's like, close to 40 million households in America kind of fall into our target demographic or target market. And they're wildly underserved with not a great set of options from existing service providers. So that's really who we exist to serve, and that's sort of the mission that we believe in. And honestly, it's as crazy as it sounds. Like, we believe that financial life and health in your financial life is as important as health in your physical life. There's a ton of studies out there that basically show that if you are not in good financial shape, it can be as detrimental to your well-being as being sick, or can cause you to become sick. So that's what we're all about at
No
Facet.
doubt.
And so, you'd ask sort of like why I'm passionate about this. So, we started the company in 2015, and my quick background: I did a tech startup out of college. I was in the early team of a company called LiveRamp, which is now a public company in the advertising technology world. And then was doing some early stage investing, and got very interested in what was going on in fintech and wealth management in particular. And in 2015, there was this thing that came out called the fiduciary rule. The Department of Labor under the Obama administration tried to pass this rule that basically said, if you're a financial advisor, you now are legally obligated to act in your client's best interests. So, okay, problem number one, that wasn't a rule before 2015, which is kind of a bit of a head scratcher. Problem number two, that rule didn't actually get passed, because the pushback from the industry was so strong. And basically the argument was like, look, there are 8 million households that have a financial advisor right now that are going to lose their advisor relationship if you pass this rule, because they can't afford to act in the best interest of their clients and service these folks at the same time. So I looked at that and was like, holy smokes, this is the industry basically admitting very publicly that they're screwing 8 million of their existing clients. And so, and then if you dig a layer deeper, what's really going on is there's a cost problem. It's too expensive to provide high quality financial planning to most consumers. And so that was really the genesis of Facet, where we said, okay, there's a huge opportunity. And most importantly, these are people who really need the help. These are probably people who need the help a lot more than multimillionaires do. Again, because you can live a much better life if your financial life is in good order. And so that's why we started the company. We're 5 years later. We've got thousands of clients in all 50 states. They work with our dedicated certified financial planners. So the kind of top level of financial advice. We work with them on everything that I talked about before, everything that money touches in your life.
I love hearing origin stories of companies. I think it's one of the most fascinating things, just to come from the very beginnings of how it actually came to an idea. So I love the fact that you guys have done that, and especially serving a need that I think everybody has. I think one of the things that I learned in my career as I started growing into an executive role, that I needed some help with this very thing. But I think a lot of financial institutions naturally want to try and be that advisor, so to speak. They kind of claim that they're actually trying to do it in financial education. But I think there's a very big difference between going to your credit union or your bank and getting some advice on how to handle certain things versus a portfolio that is much bigger and broader in nature than the bank or credit union could even serve. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about what are the challenges that financial institutions face when trying to build relationships related to the financial well-being. What are those challenges?
That's a big question. I think there's a few. I think there's a few paths that we could go down here. I mean, the one I'd start with is sort of the general belief that you could solve for financial planning through financial products. And I don't think it's through the fault of a lot of advisors who are in the industry who are, selling annuities or, selling certain financial products. I think that, there's so much money to be made in those products that there's, that the companies they represent have been sort of pushing them, through the channels as aggressively as they can. But, the fact of the matter is, you got to take a step back and look at what's best for the client from a sort of holistic planning view, right? Like, a lot of times you can solve for a client's needs without actually touching their money. I'll give you a very specific example. We have a client. She's a lady in her mid 60s, and she was working with one of our advisors, and she said, my happy place is the beach. Like, a big goal of mine, as silly as this sounds, a big financial goal is to be able to take my two grandkids to the beach. I haven't been in 20 years, and I just don't think that it's financially responsible for me to go. And our advisor looked at her cash flow and said, you could go tomorrow for like 2 weeks if you wanted to. And a month later they were meeting again, and she was telling a story about how she went to the beach, and showing pictures over video, and we had the call recording. Like, they both end up crying because it's just such like a meaningful moment in this woman's life that you don't get there by putting someone in an annuity, right? It's like you get there by actually listening to them. What do they want? And then figuring out how they can achieve it. And so I think, problem number one is sort of like putting the solution ahead of the problem and not really fully understanding the problem. And so that's the first bucket. The second thing I would say is really around the tech investment, and this is probably a little more inside baseball, but like the tech investment by and large in the fintech world has really gone into cheaper product and better distribution. And so if you look at, like a robo advisor as an example, the real innovation there is not anything that interesting. It's basically taking a commodity and making it a little bit cheaper on the margin, with the idea that you can make it more accessible. But it doesn't actually solve like the core problem. Certainly, it doesn't solve the relationship problem, right? Like, how do you actually make it so that a human advisor can build a better relationship with a client? The way you do that is that you take all of the non-relationship building activities off the advisor's plate. So here's a crazy stat for you. The average CFP today takes about 3 hours of prep and wrap up time for every hour of client facing time. So if you think about, you asked the question, what are the challenges in building a relationship? 75% of their time is spent doing stuff that's actually very non-value add. And so if you have great tech and great tools that can automate all of that stuff away, which is it's all very automatable. It's not a huge, it's not like, super complex stuff. It's just calculations and, pulling presentations together and going into different systems and, compiling data in a way that sort of tells the clients the right story about their financial picture. That's stuff that technology can do. What technology can't do is sit on the phone and actually listen to the nuance in a client's voice about what's stressing them and what's not, and then help them, build a plan accordingly.
That's some good stuff right there. One of the things that I think that is very interesting that you mentioned was also the fact that, like, we're talking about tech and consolidation, and and you brought up the robo thing. I can't tell you how many times that I think about AI and
Hmm.
this distribution of like AI technology, and everyone thinking that, like, oh, it's going to replace like jobs and all that stuff. And while it will in some cases, I also think that there's a real value add. And I think that credit unions especially do this well. And that's not taking away some of those automations to keep it human, right? Like having a human
Hmm.
actually understand the situation, understand your problem, and not go directly to a solution. I think the credit unions do that really, really well. And it's part of their value. And I think that they can learn a little bit from this episode, just understanding that, like, look, technology is important. You need to invest in it. You need to automate some of your processes. That does not mean that it's going to fully replace your relationship building, and you've still got to do that.
Well, credit unions are also, and I'll admit I'm a little bit of a novice in this because it's not our area of focus, but I know enough to be dangerous, and I'll say that credit unions are also somewhat unique in their position of trust with their customer base, right? Because typically they're endorsed by whatever organization that they represent, and they are at a much they're in a much better place to or they're in a much better position to build those relationships because they already have that sort of implicit endorsement of trust. Compare
Mm-hmm.
that to a uh, insurance company. I won't name any names, but I'm sure you can imagine, right? An insurance company that exists to sell products, right? Like, credit unions are much more sort of community focused, and so I would say that they're actually probably in a much better place to to invest in the relationship. But everything that I said still stands, right? You have to have the planning first focus. You have to approach each client from a first principle standpoint of what does this client actually need and how can I help them? And then tailor the product to the advice, not the other way around. And then number two is think about what technology is going to make their advisors' lives easier. I mean, if you think about what client experience truly is, it's not logging into the website. I mean, that's certainly part of it, but it's also what's every touch point and every interaction they have with your brand, from walking through the door, although no one's doing much of that these days, but logging onto Zoom, interacting with a human being. If that person that they're interacting with hates their job and is miserable and feels like they're overworked, underpaid, and don't have the right tools, that's going to have a negative impact on your client experience. And I think that people talk about client experience in this vacuum where it's a very sort of tactical consideration around UI on a web page, and it's actually the entire set of interactions that a client has with your brand. And it's so important to think about what does that look like end to end. We spend a lot of time thinking about that at Facet, and I'll tell you, it's never done, right? I mean, we're maybe 10% of where I want us to be. And, I hope a year from now, we're still 10% of where I want us to be, because that means that there's so much more opportunity ahead of us to get better.
When I spent some time in the customer experience space, one of the things that we learned a lot about was journey mapping. And
Mm-hmm.
what's so interesting is it oftentimes starts there, building out that journey to understanding it completely, because it is totally multifaceted. It's not just one single journey. And one thing that's interesting to me is how it really is never done. And I'll give you an example. If you think about how things changed in 2020, about how people weren't going into a branch as much, all of a sudden Zoom video became like their branch experience. And that's a completely different journey. So now all of these organizations that were in the financial services world had to reshift their thinking around what the journey looked like and how it became 100% digital. That was a big shift for people, right? And having to adjust to that need has a direct impact, to your point, on the member and customer experience, 100%. But you've got to truly understand the journey.
Yeah, 100%. And it's totally doable. I mean, one of my favorite examples, this is going to be a random one, not at all specific to financial services, but I don't know if you've been to a Chick-fil-A recently. And during the pandemic, they completely remade their whole operation. So instead of having the in-person dining and a one-lane drive-through, they've now turned their parking lots into like four-lane drive-throughs and taken the inside of the restaurant and turned that into the whole creation and cooking and packaging and whatever it is they do in there. And that's an example of like someone saying, okay, change is here to stay, right? Or at least it changed, at least for the near future. And they adapted incredibly quickly, and I bet they're selling 2x as much as they were pre-pandemic. And I think the companies that are going to adapt best to this new world order, which we're undoubtedly in, are the ones that are willing to attack the sacred cows and basically say, you know what, this is something that, yes, we thought that the in-person branch experience was very important in 2018. Well, it's not going to be anymore, and we have to adapt and think about it. And it's amazing how many companies are so stuck that they won't. They're thinking, okay, well, this is a blip in the radar, and we'll be back to what that looks like. And I just think that that's a very foolhardy and short-sighted way of doing things.
I actually agree with you, and I love the Chick-fil-A example, so no apologies there. Let's talk about the financial institutions and their focus on the member and customers' goals. What are some ways in which they can, one, identify what those goals are, and two, start focusing on them and as they integrate that into the journey?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a good question. And so I'll give you my my answer, which comes, I'm not a CFP, I'm not a financial advisor. So, others will have probably more detailed or slightly different takes than I will. And my answer will seem glaringly obvious, which is, the number one thing you have to do is ask the client why they're here. There's a reason why every client opts into working with a financial advisor. And you can bucket those reasons. Usually there's something around safety and security. That seems to be by far the number one. Usually there's something around trying to grow their assets. Um, Whether or not that's a good goal once you are sort of educated on how hard it is to beat the market is up for debate, but that is, certainly in the sort of in the zeitgeist. It's a big reason why clients choose to work with financial advisors. Um, and then there's another which tends to be around like some big life event happening and them wondering, the client wondering how they should even think about that from a money perspective. And so I think that, it starts with you got to understand who your client is and what your client wants. And then you can kind of go from there. And then the interesting thing that the financial advisor, the institution has that a lot of other services don't is, there is hopefully a fiduciary responsibility where, you also in theory know more than the client and can sort of help them understand, okay, you want to save for a down payment on a house. By the way, you have two kids and a spouse who doesn't work. You have no life insurance. Like, we need to talk about your overall risk management too. So there's a fiduciary lens you have to put on top of that too. And so I think, if you start with those two things, which is what does the client want and what does your fiduciary responsibility say that they need, and you combine those, I mean, that's the starting point of a phenomenal relationship that you can have where you're showing value, you're answering their needs, you're kind of meeting them where they are, but you're also adding value in ways that they're not thinking about when they come to work with you.
I love this. One of the things that you mentioned that I specifically wanted to call out too was you brought up the whole vacation example a little bit
Hmm.
earlier in the podcast, and you kind of just led there a little bit on how they can start weaving into the actual real things that they want to try and do with their finances. So
Hmm.
how does you and your team discover those moments outside of just like I think, believe it or not, like even though it sounds super simple on asking like why are you here,
Hmm.
like sometimes it is those simple moments of asking just a small little question like that. What are some other ways in which you and your team discover those little moments?
I mean, we I think it all comes back to enabling the relationship to happen, right? Because you can ask the question explicitly. So when we onboard a client, they go through a three-step onboarding process where before they even talk to one of our advisors to make sure that it's the right fit. Like, we don't want to waste our client's time. We don't want to waste our time. Like, we want to make sure that what we offer is what they need. And in that process, we send them login info to our website. There's a whole questionnaire they go through and fill out, and there's little prompts along the way. And then when we have a client actually sign up with us, their first step with their planner that is what we call a Let's Go meeting, which stands for Let's Get Organized. And there are parts of that process that sort of prompt these discussions, right, and prompt these sort of questions and goal identification. But the way that a lot of this stuff comes out is really over the course of a relationship that you build with someone, and you feel more comfortable telling them about these things. I mean, I would use like the healthcare analogy again. The first time you meet your doctor, you're probably not going to ask all of the crazy questions that you have in your mind that you're like, Googling on WebMD and scaring the crap out of yourself. With like it takes a couple times before you build a relationship with your doctor before you're willing to really share, some of the deeper things that are concerning you. In a lot of cases, we view our service almost as like a partly therapy, right? I mean, a lot of the times the conversations actually have nothing to do with money. It's more about like, man, I think I might be getting a divorce. I'm not really sure. How like it obviously always leads back to the financial situation, but there's a lot of things in there. It takes a while to get comfortable with that. So long-winded answer to basically say enabling doing things that enable that relationship to blossom sooner rather than later always pays dividends in the long run.
Let's recap a little bit. You mentioned two separate things that people can do today.
Hmm.
Let's recap on those 1 to 2 things that financial institutions can do today to address this very problem of financial education and planning. Um, let's talk about that really quick.
So you mean enabling the relationships and understanding the client, and then better technology,
Yep.
and enabling the advisors to spend more time with their clients.
Yeah, let's just recap on it really quick. We can cut that other part out real fast. That's not a big deal. So let's just recap on the 1 to 2 things that financial institutions can do today to address this.
Sure. So I think two key things. Number one is understand your customer. Spend time getting to know them. Figure out what it is that they want and put your fiduciary lens on top of their wants and needs so that you have sort of a holistic solution that you're working with them on. Number two is enable your advisors to do their job, which is really their highest and best use is that human to human relationship. Get rid of all of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that is not client facing, and enable them to build those longer term relationships with their clients so that they can have an ongoing process of discovery in terms of what's important in their financial lives.
Love it. Anders Jones, co-founder and CEO of Facet Wealth. Thank you for joining us. Lastly, I'd love for the audience to know where they can reach you in Facet Wealth.
Yeah, so facetwealth.com is our website. If you want to talk to one of our client success managers and see if Facet's the right fit for you, we're all about it. You can set that up right on our website. And then you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Anders Jones. I don't tweet a lot, but feel free to at me.
The only reason why I'm on Twitter is because of my sports. That's well, and actually I do follow a lot of financial follows on there. So that's the only 2 things that I use Twitter for. That everything else is like I go to LinkedIn and all that other stuff. So there, find Anders Jones on Twitter, facetwealth.com. Please look at it. Make sure that you put in your requests. If you have any specific questions for Anders, you can reach out to him. Thank you again for joining us, Anders. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Take care.